welcome to today's episode of Political Speaking. I'm Terry, and as always, we are here to dissect the stories shaping our political landscape and their relevance to our lives that we lead. So today, we are diving into a topic that strikes at the heart of governance, accountability, and the public's right to know. So by now, I believe everyone knows that there are two ministers who are suing over an article they claim is defamatory. But to understand how do we arrive at this point, let us rewind to where it all began. So in September 2024, the online citizen, us, published a report that brought the issue into sharper focus, where the report revealed that Minister K. Shanmugam had sold his good class bungalow, GCB, for 88 million to his trust, Jasmine Settlement, via UBS. So this sale occurred in August 2024, just a month after Shanmugam and Minister Vivian Balakrishnan had addressed the parliament in July 2023 about their rental of the historic black and white bungalows on Bridal Road. And public outcry over the rental was particularly sharp given how Shanmugam, as Minister for Law, overseeing the Singapore Land Authority. So shortly after the TOC article, Bloomberg published a follow-up on 12th of December on adding further relevations to the issue. So the article from Bloomberg reported that Minister Tan See Leng had purchased a GCB for $27.3 million. So Bloomberg's report also raised further questions about the transparency of GCB transactions, especially how trusts can obscure the identities of the purchasers in public records. But the government has stated that it monitors and knows the ultimate beneficiaries of such transactions. But then concerns still lingers as to whether or not the public should have access to such information. On 16th of December, the ministers responded to Bloomberg's article as well as other publications that have reported on the relevations by issuing letters of demands to TOC, Bloomberg, The Edge Singapore, alleging that the reports were defamatory and malicious. So this legal action appeared aimed at securing retractions and apologies. However, many of the public interpret this moves as having a chilling effect, discouraging journalists from investigating or reporting on the financial dealings of the public figures, such as the politicians. But today's conversation isn't about the ministers' transactions themselves. Instead, we're going to zoom out to address the bigger issue of asset declaration by public servants. Shouldn't the public have the right to know the financial interests and holdings of those entrusted with governing them? Yeah. So let's take a moment to consider a recent example from Thailand. So Prime Minister Paetongtarn Shinawatra recently declared her wealth to be to the National Anti-Corruption Commission, revealing that she has over US $400 million in assets, including 200 designer handbags worth $2 million and 75 luxury watches valued at almost $5 million USD. So such transparency isn't an option. It is in fact a legal requirement under Thai law. So public office holders must declare their assets and liability to ensure accountability and prevent conflicts of interest. So now contrast that with Singapore, where the Code of Conduct for Ministers mandates that the public office holders declare their source of income, assets, and financial liabilities to the President through the Prime Minister. Similarly, civil servants must declare their investments and properties annually or upon occurring significant assets. But here's the critical difference. The public has no access to the information that is being declared in the case of Singapore. So this lack of transparency raises important questions. So why shouldn't the public have access to this asset declaration? Wouldn't such openness enhance trust and accountability in governance? And that brings us to today's discussion. as the ministers weigh whether or not to take the unprecedented step of seeking court's permission to serve reads on Bloomberg in US and myself, Terry Shi, in Taiwan, we have to ask ourselves, is the real issue their legal battle or the public right to know how public officials handle their financial interests? Shouldn't transparency in governance be the ultimate goal? So joining us here today is Dr. Tjin, Managing Director of New Narrative, and Sean Francis Han, a PhD student at the National University of Singapore and former Chief Editor of Breakup Singapore. So without further ado, maybe can we have PJ to kick things off?
Well, before we start, I think everyone wants to really understand, Terry. What on earth are they actually trying to claim is defamatory?
Oh,
Because
okay.
they also POFMA the article, and the
Right.
POFMA states that okay, the stuff that you wrote about government oversight, lack of oversight, whatever, is false, right? All of that. Okay, you corrected that, but the POFMA doesn't touch on Shanmugam on Tan Sealing. So all of that must be true. So if it's true, how on earth is it defamatory? So what exactly are they claiming? I don't understand.
So they are claiming that the inference, the innuendo from the articles from Bloomberg and that the article from TOC was that the ministers are making use of such transaction, meaning sale through trust, to obscure their private assets. Both in Bloomberg's article and in TOC's article, we state very clearly, nothing is illegal. This is perfectly legal. This is actually in policy wise. And while and we just pointed out, while legal, it might not be ethical. You know, so
Yeah,
so you cannot. It's actually very hard to say that we are accusing them of corruption or anything, but they are just simply that.
yeah.
I would say, and this my response to them is like, hey, you cannot be. You are not denying that you brought and sold the GCB. You are just simply not happy that how it paints you, as in
Yeah,
by selling and buying through the trust.
yeah. In most countries, if you state something, if something is true, it cannot be defamatory by definition. I
Correct.
don't know how in Singapore, because of all these years of abusing, the defamation laws and the way it's been interpreted and whatever, that you can like say something which is true and then still be considered defamatory. I don't. This is
Well,
crazy.
see,
It's
and,
all
and this
crazy.
see, this is the point what I raised in my public statement, is
Mm.
that in Singapore, right, you can't defend at all because while the article is factual, but the ministers are claiming a risk to damage of reputation, despite the risk being like say 0.00001%. If the judge were to take the position that okay, you have a risk, the risk that risk, right, would just equate to okay, the ministers won their suit
But
because there is no
they
such thing
did
as
the action. You're just reporting factually about
right,
what they
correct,
did.
right.
It's not you that did the action. You just report factually, they did X. Then they go, oh, because you say I did X, therefore my reputation may be damaged. Which is insane.
I,
But
I
that's
think
Singapore, I
we have to
guess.
look at it historically because um uh the defamation law that Singapore relies on now, right, is when Singapore is ruled by a colonial force. So the laws actually is meant to protect the lords from as in accusations or criticism. So and when Singapore became independent, right, we adopt the laws wholesale, and then our political masters are actually using it as this they are our colonial laws. Because if you were to refer to the UK, which actually gave us the laws, if Shanmugam were to go in UK and then file the same suit, right, it will be thrown out immediately because he cannot prove that he had suffered any damages in terms of reputation, just like how Sir Dyson case was against a publication was thrown out in the same manner because he made certain claims, but then he cannot justify it with any damages to his reputation, and that is the crux, the central difference where Singapore courts don't really care whether or not the reputation has been damaged or not. so long the risk is there, then it's considered as the suit is qualified.
Actually, this kind of dovetails into your bigger point, right? Because we tend to think of Singapore as inheriting laws from Britain or the UK, when actually Singapore's laws are inherited from British colonial tradition. And the British imposed far harsher laws on their colonies than they imposed on themselves. And they were very happy to fiddle around with how the system worked in their colonies to ensure that they had an advantage, that the people in power had an advantage. So whenever we say, oh, Britain, mother of parliaments, your Westminster system, it's actually not true. What we have is a colonial system that we inherited that the PAP then continued to use in a very colonial way, right? And so when you look at things like defamation, but also when you look at things like this lack of accountability, right? The laws are actually the way that they're written, the way we've inherited them, are more to protect people of power and people of money and people of property, right? That is the consistent through line of British colonial laws, whether it's India, whether it's Africa, or whether it's Asia, right? That these laws are actually to protect the people of power and wealth in a colony. And those are the laws that we continue to operate and work with today, right? And that's why we have this broader situation where there's a lack of accountability. And then the PAP keeps saying, own self, check on self. And, that is clearly not working.
Yeah. So like if I'm not wrong, it was in the era where East India Company still operated, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, you have to remember Singapore's specific history, where Malaya is a colony created for capitalist exploitation, right? The British didn't really care about Malaya until suddenly they found two things, rubber and tin. Then suddenly they were all in on Malaya. They came in, they really exploited it, right? And Singapore was the port through which all this rubber and tin were exported. And so in order to govern effectively, they had to really, put in all these laws to protect their profits. And naturally, the people of Malaya have always fought back against that, right? Through the Malayan Communist Party, through socialist organizations like the PAP. So the British then kept introducing laws, culminating in the Declaration of Emergency, to try and suppress the people, suppress their ability to fight for a decent wage, fight for a fair livelihood, to fight for their rights. And that's the problem is the laws that were introduced in the emergency, most of them then became on the statute books, right? So one of the arguments I've always made is that Singapore has never left the state of emergency because these laws that were introduced during the Malayan emergency are still on our books, starting with the ISA, right? The Criminal Law Temporary Provisions Act, the Sedition Act, right? These are laws designed to protect power from being challenged by the people, and those laws are still there today.
I mean, there's so much to say. I mean, earlier I was kind of freaking out with Terry a little bit, right? Because, um, I'd been looking at this story for a bit, and it never quite made sense to me, right? I was looking around on Singapore Law Watch, and I was reading this little article that they had, and they made this statement that there was a correction notice on the site and then stating that the original article had been deleted. But if you go to the article on Bloomberg, it says no such thing. It merely says that it was updated, right? On top of that, I've been trying to find out ways in which the correction on gov.sg, how any of what is being stated could reasonably be found and I read for a long number of hours and I just couldn't find it, right? You see the first point says there are no publicly available government records of JCB sale transactions. I have no idea where in the article that can be found. Second point, identity need not be disclosed to the government. Again, this is not, I mean, like the word government itself is like barely mentioned in the article. Where are these like inferences or assertions being made at all? This is bizarre. It's not even, I could perhaps be more charitable to to say something like, oh, the government's like really set in its mindset, there's this frame of mind and they will contest things that disagree with their political values, like we saw recently with the case of TJC. But what is this? I'm still trying to understand it. I thought for sure there must have been an older article that was maybe a bit more combative, maybe, said some of the things that perhaps, could be found on gov.sg. And I searched the archives and I've searched the net. I just can't find, there's no existence of an older deleted article where these claims could be found. So I'm just very, very confused at this point. I think that this is, it's a low. It's really a low. I mean, where is any of this being said? The article itself is so modest, which is what you'd expect from Bloomberg, right? Which is consistently ranked as one of the more objective, albeit slightly left-leaning, one of the better, least biased news sources out there. It's been around for 30 years. I mean, it's a modest article. Where are these attacks and these combative attacks against the government? Where is the government reading these things? I am still really trying to process all of it.
Okay.
It's bizarre. Last session you mentioned like gaslighting. Yeah, this is it, man. I just can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Before we lose this train of thought, okay, let me remind you that the one of the demand that the letter of demands that the two ministers sent was for the removal of the article. The removal of the articles from Bloomberg, The Age Singapore, and on TOC. So, had Bloomberg complied with the demand and TOC complied with demand, anyone who wants to double check what POFMA said, what the POFMA office claimed about the article, could not double verify with the article because the article has been removed. Meaning, right, the government or the POFMA office or the ministry would have the final say. If you were to say that the ministry misrepresented the publications and then put what they wrote, people like Sean Francis Hunt would not be able to double check that the article itself did not make those statements. You will be forced to, as you pointed out, give a charitable position, a take, saying that the POFMA office clearly would not have lied or would not have misrepresented the statements made by the article, and therefore you're given the impression that they did say what the POFMA office said, and this is the whole travesty of the thing. A POFMA was issued on articles, and then the ministers issue a letter of demand to remove the article. You put that two together, right? You're just rewriting the whole, the narrative by means of your legal suit and your law.
So yeah, I mean, there's a certain irony that, with this issue of the GCBs and the and the legal issues or the legal demands that have come out of it, there is still a lack of transparency. Even this correction is unclear, at least to me. If I'm missing something, let me know. But I've spent hours. I still don't get it. I just don't understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
Perhaps let's frame this better as a question, so that you can chime in. Do you think that it is appropriate for the members of public to know the assets of the high-ranking public officers, or do you think that such information should be like private, confidential, only be kept by the Prime Minister?
Well, Terry, do you remember some years ago, Lee Hsien Loong talked about a natural aristocracy, right?
Yeah, I wrote an article on that.
Yes, and he said, the elite political class, the implication is they're superior, inherently superior. See, natural aristocracy, right, comes from Plato, and Plato suggested it as a class who would govern very impartially, disinterestedly. But what Lee Hsien Loong totally missed is that Plato said in order for there to be a natural aristocracy who can be impartial, they must not own property. They must not have children. their interests must be identified entirely with the state. And so the state should provide for them 100%. You see, so the property is inherently a conflict of interest, because when you govern the country, but you also have property, then naturally you'd be inclined, you'd be incentivized to adopt policies which increase the value of your property. You'd be, likewise, having children, you'd be incentivized to pass policies, to have policies which benefit your children, right? So if you look at the flip side of that, right, why does the Catholic Church, when it has priests, why do those priests forswear their other vows, give up their property, no family, celibacy? Because then they identify entirely with the church, right? This is a political argument rather than a religious one. And that's why the Catholic Church is the most powerful non-government organization in the whole world, because it takes in all these bright people and cuts off all their ties to anyone else so that they think only first and foremost the church. And so that's basically Plato's argument, right? And so this is the problem. We know, Plato knew 2,000 years ago, we know today, property is itself a conflict of interest. But it's unreasonable, we feel, in a modern society to say, oh, give up all your property. And it's unreasonable to say, oh, don't have children, don't have families. So instead, what we do is we make people openly declare all of their property so that everyone else knows that they have their property, right? All these interests, stocks, shares, houses, whatever, so that when we look at this person, we understand what their interests are, but also that they then can't then pass all sorts of laws meant to enrich themselves secretly. You see, so that's the general principle, right? And that's why we need to have these transparency laws. And that's why, of course, in Singapore, I think that's why the government doesn't want their transparency laws, because they benefit, they're incentivized, right, to benefit from the policies they pass, right? And that is a huge, huge problem for us.
I want to wholeheartedly agree with PJ's point there, right? And I'm personally of the belief as well that yes, when you enter into public life, then yes, there are a lot of things that have to be given up, privacy being one of them, right? However, right, even if one were to take the opposite position and say that no, privacy comes before all else, yes, even if you've given yourself to the public life, one should still have some level of privacy, right? Even if one were to take that point of view, the way that the government has handled this issue is completely off. We can have two positions here, right? PJ and I both believe in, going into the public life and that sacrifice and having that very high standard for those who serve the public, right? I could also see people on the other side of the camp, right? What I cannot understand is this extremely heavy-handed way of the government coming down on views that it disagrees with, right? Fundamentally, this really could have been a case where the government used this issue to its advantage to speak to the public about issues of privacy, about issues of housing, what are the requirements, right, of privacy that should be placed on our ministers, on those who have entered into public or political life, right? And that's precisely the problem. We can have our disagreements in a civil democratic society, but not if the government is going to use every situation like this one, every controversy, every time Reddit starts to blow up, every time people, some news organization like Bloomberg or The Economist or Amnesty says something a little bad, you come down on these organizations. You come down on people who are trying to make a valid point. That's fundamentally what I disagree with. That's fundamentally what I cannot understand. It could have been such a good opportunity to speak to the public, to consult with the public, right? To deal with these issues in a mature civil way. But no, slam the Bofma hammer.
Well, the argument that is coming from the government supporters is that oh no, we already find it so hard to attract all those credible candidates into politics, or by introducing like such requirements for transparency of their assets would then scare them away. What would you respond to that?
Let's say that that really is, an argument, right? We try to be charitable, principle of charity. We try and say that that's the case, right? I think it must also be taken with a very, very, very huge pinch of salt right there, because there is a severe information asymmetry in Singapore, right? So you can say that, yes, on the one hand, you know, some amount of transparency or some benefits or some privacy should be accorded to those who enter into the public life, those who enter into politics, right? Sure, but on the other hand, you must also consider the information asymmetry in Singapore. And information asymmetry, as we are looking at in this case, really creates a kind of powerlessness in the people. It creates a distrust, it creates speculation, it fosters fake news, right? There is a very brilliant quote from the Bloomberg article, right, by Alan Cheong, who's this executive director of research, um, where he says the problem with opacity is the fallout from public perception is much worse than the actual problem, and that's really the issue that we're dealing with here. Yeah, even if you want to say, yeah, there should be some benefits to attract these kind of talents, let's also consider the other side, right? Because I'm going to say, just from sitting in taxis and going down to the coffee shop, right? The kind of speculation and fake news and distrust of the government is widespread. Just sit in a taxi, book a Grab, you will hear it,
Can I also just, to respond to your question, Terry, point out that everywhere else in the world where there are these transparency and accountability laws, it doesn't dissuade anyone from running for office, right? Running for elected office has a huge number of benefits, and is also a chance to serve your country. And so I don't see these laws dissuading people anywhere else in the world. A and B, of course, Singapore has the highest paid politicians in the world. So you can argue that they are already compensated for giving up, their private lives, giving up these things which other people don't have to do, and having to be more accountable, right? They're well compensated.
I think people need to understand why there's a need for the declaration in the first place. It's not just simply to for the sake of gossip, for the sake of like I want to intrude into a private life. I think people need to understand the reason for your declaration is that we know that say before entering politics you have say $1 million. After your term in politics, you have $5 million. Please explain where you get the money from. You need people. If we want to say that that politicians sacrifice by going to politics, right? You need to show that you really sacrifice, meaning you have a like a standstill of your income, you earn less, or in fact maybe your assets even depreciated. But if you were to exit politics being richer than what you were before, then you can't say that you make any sacrifice because you benefited financially, not to mention other forms of benefits. So this is actually, it's not to say that the politicians are corrupted. It's really to say that whether or not the politician pursued policies that benefited them financially. I think this is where people need to understand we are not trying to like intrude into people's privacy. We are not trying to like know the needs and cranks of individuals. We need to know this so that we can hold people accountable.
And I just quickly also point out, South Korea, all but two of their presidents have ended up in jail, I think, or impeached, or gone through a lengthy trial, or in trouble. All but two, right? After they left office. And the two, one was Kim Dae-jung, who was in jail as a political prisoner before he was in office, and the other was the president. I forget his name. Before Park, right? He's like the only one, and yet there's no shortage of people who want to be president in South Korea. So it's not a problem. But yeah,
Yeah.
I agree with you, Terry. Yeah, we need to have accountability. People need to be accountable, and this is part of why also if you don't have this sort of thing, people end up sitting in office for decades and decades and refuse to leave because they know the moment they leave, they're going to get in trouble, right? So you need all these things to also protect people from their own worst instincts.
I wanted to jump off your point just now, right? I think you made a very brilliant point when you said that, um, yeah, it's kind of odd, right, when you enter into political and public life and you come out better than you were before you entered it, right? And that just, it reminded me of this word that got thrown around so much, which is corruption, you know. And what really strikes me, I think, is how this word kind of gets thrown around so much because you're right. Nobody is accusing the government of corruption, right? But there seems to be this very, very simplistic understanding of corruption, right? Is it merely just breaking the law, taking money from under the table, or is that all that it is? I think what we're interested in is something a little bit more insidious, right? Um, wherein these individuals with power foster this information asymmetry, right? All the information with me, none with you, exacerbate inequality. You bully and strong arm your detractors into a state of fear so that you can continue to use entirely legal means to benefit yourself and your party. Um, so that's kind of what I'm more interested in, right? If you just keep thinking about, oh, everybody's accusing me of corruption, well, that's a very convenient way of covering up the issue here, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Francis raised a very good point. In Singapore, right, corruption is always about I doing a favor and there's an exchange of monetary or other favors. But we
Yes,
don't
this
really.
cartoonish, like, Netflix kind of like secret bribes or things like that. But it's just no,
Oh,
that's not the issue that anybody's concerned with.
yeah, it's also say example a person in power uses the authority to compel a agency to do something that is uh, in favor of someone they know. Say example, I live in this HDB flat. I am someone of a person to make decisions, and I decide, say, okay, we would do renovation for the void deck where I stay. Where am I staying? So there is no like exchange of financial benefits in this sense. But then I benefit in a way by having a facility that's near my residence refurbished.
And might I add also, right, even if your definition of corruption is this sort of one-dimensional concept that hinges entirely on the idea of legality, what then is your legality worth if you yourself are in charge of it and wherein its checks and balances are conspicuously absent in there is an absence of the fourth estate of independent free media to really hold your feet to the fire, to hold you accountable. And I'm just thinking back also then to the Redoubt Road debacle. There was the investigation into corrupt practices conducted by the CPIB. Elected officer responsible is Lawrence Wong, right? That is just a little bit odd there, right? So if your concept of corruption hinges on legality, then your legality better be worth something, right? It doesn't seem to stand for much here, when there are just this conspicuous lack of check and balances. Yeah.
Okay, so I just want to make one point, and I want to really spell it out for Singaporeans why this is so important, right? Singaporeans right now are really struggling with cost of living. Okay, why is cost of living so high? Rents are by far the biggest factor driving up the cost of living. Why HDB prices so high? Price of land is driving up, price of property. And this is directly related to the issue that we're talking about because for politicians to legally, right, enrich themselves, what can they do? Increase their salary, which is already done, but also politically very, very difficult, right? It's a dynamite, political dynamite. But second thing, invest in stocks. And the third thing, invest in property. Remember, Singapore has no capital gains tax. One of the most reliable investments you can do in Singapore is real estate investment trusts because the rents just keep going up and people, small shop holders keep getting squeezed, right? But imagine if you're a politician, right? A minister invested in a real estate investment trust, you're getting good returns. You don't have to pay capital gains tax. Imagine if you buy a piece of land and you know the price is going to go up, 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 not just because you want to, but because politically, as we've discussed before, right? You need the HDB to maintain its value because otherwise Singaporeans cannot afford to retire. So this is how you enrich yourselves legally in Singapore. And this is then impacting the bottom line of Singaporeans because two theoretical ways in which Singaporean politicians can enrich themselves also then means that cost of living is driven up, 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 and it means that housing is constantly increasing in price and out of the reach of ordinary Singaporeans. So this is directly related to the cost of living, cost of housing crisis that we are having, right? So this isn't just some theoretical thing about accountability or transparency. This is directly affecting all our bottom lines, and we should be very concerned.
And if I might just add a cherry on top of PJ's point right there, right? There's a quote in the Bloomberg article as well, right? Which is that Mao Tan paid sold for 50 million his Holland Rise mansion, and that he is a former minister who once oversaw public housing in the city, right? If that isn't the mother of all ironies, if that isn't a point to be hammered home about how the government is out of touch, I don't know what is.
Well, it's not irony, but it's a clear conflict of interest.
I mean, 50,000 households live in rental housing in Singapore, right? Yeah, it's absurd. Yeah.
Right.
But you see, that's why yeah.
Let's break that down. See, if I'm in the Minister of National Development and I own a private property, I would, if say I want to legally increase the price of my property, I would then restrict the number of HDB flats that are being built, restrict the number of properties that are being in the market. So as the usual goes, the high demand and low supply, the prices will go up. So in a way, I could legally jack the price of my private estate property, and then by the term, and this is obviously would not reverse after I leave office. So essentially, I've already created a start of my property appreciation process. So
Or
could
you
cash
could
out anytime.
also pack Singapore with more and more people, increasing demand, right? So it takes time, and there's only so much space. Ultimately, there are only so many flats you can build. But if you look at Singapore's recent history, what has been happening a lot more? You have HDB houses built, yes, more HDBs built, but our population, our resident population has skyrocketed, and that increased demand for housing has driven the prices up.
Which come back to the whole issue here. It's like if ministers, we currently know that there are two ministers who previously owned GCB. We don't really know what about the other ministers or the other senior political office holders, whether do they hold private properties of certain value. So with that with that lack of information, we don't know, right, what is driving their position when it comes to supporting certain policy. Whether is it the reluctance to decouple public housing from certain prices, certain factors, or whether or not to put to lower the number of people that we are introducing to Singapore on a yearly basis. So if they do have properties that might appreciate under circumstances, then voters ought to know. Voters ought to know that they are making such decisions while having such consideration for their personal interest, because then it's actually very hard for us to believe that such decisions are made for the interest of Singaporeans, because they would surely benefit from such policy making. So before we conclude today's session, I think maybe we can invite PJ and Francis to share their concluding thoughts on the matter.
I just want to say that I think that the raw nerve that might have been touched here, right? Because stifling of the freedom of the press and heavy-handed approaches to governance are nothing new, right? But I think the raw nerve that might have been struck here really might be the obscene wealth of the people who are in power that was just revealed to the public, and that's the importance. That's the importance of having this information out in the public, right? You look at TSL, 27.3 million, Shan, 88 million, Balakrishna renting for $20,000 a month. I mean, you talk about, the government likes to talk about minority representation, right? And then they hand us this sort of like Halimah Yacob, they hand us GRC system. And it's all nonsense. Give me some working class workers representation. Give me somebody who doesn't stay in a home that is more money than people see in their lifetimes. Give me somebody who knows basically what it is to live in the heartlands with the people who see the struggles that people are going through on a day-to-day basis. Give me some workers representation, not this, this completely false and fraudulent idea of, minority representation.
The minority that is overrepresented in government are millionaires. That's the one minority that's very well represented. Yeah, I think my closing thought would be just to ask Singaporeans, do you really think that these people are governing in your best interests, right? When they don't understand the life you lead, they don't understand the cost you face. When you're a millionaire, you have so much money, and then the price of food keeps going up. To them, it's just a fraction of their wealth. It's just nothing, right? And they don't understand what it's like to be caught up in yet another MRT failure because they're in their big private cars. They don't understand just how bad life is for the rest of us. So even if you have the nicest person, most well-intentioned person, they just don't understand how our lives are because they are so incredibly wealthy, and that wealth insulates them from any of the cares and concerns. And that's why they're more interested in building big, big buildings, right? Big infrastructure, the Founders Memorial, right? Expanding Changi Airport, more roads for cars, because that's the things that they use, that they understand, that they see increases GDP, right? That they can look at and feel proud about. It's the little things that really matter to us, keeping the price of coffee affordable. To them, coffee could be $20 a cup to be affordable. So ask yourself, Singaporeans, is this really the kind of people you want governing us, right? And even if there's nothing wrong with, wanting to be wealthy, but we need to make sure that we have a system that aligns their interests with our interests. Because ultimately, remember, they can't lose the election. The election is unfree, unfair, it's tilted, it's rigged to everything except actually stuffing the ballot box. So they're not going to lose the election. What have they got to worry about? So they're just going to govern and have policies which to them make a lot of sense. But to us, they don't benefit us, right? So Singaporeans, please think carefully.
When it comes to accountability, I think Singaporeans don't really ask for much. People just simply ask manageable cost of living, and they always hold this idea that the public servants are in it for the people. In it, they are sacrificing their personal careers so to stand in politics. But if you look at it, closely, we realize actually most of the politicians are civil servants. So to them, it's just a promotion from civil servants to another career. So frankly, there's no sacrifice. I mean, personally, I would say there's no sacrifice, and which is why it is important for the declaration of assets, as I pointed out earlier. It would be illuminating if we were to see that politicians in fact got richer after entering politics, and the only way for us to get to know whether this is true or not is to have the public declaration of assets for politicians before they enter the office, before they step into office, and then when they exit office, and also I think in some countries requiring to declare, I think after 5 or 10 years later, so that they know that whether there's any residue income coming in. So yes, this is as what is pointed by PJ and Francis. I think people need to understand accountability on politicians is not to intrude into their privacy, but it's really to ensure that they are held accountable to the policy that they introduce, and then also to assess whether or not there's any other reasons for why they push for certain policies. Yes, and so
I mean, you can only have a functioning democracy with an educated and informed public. Very simple.
And as Francis pointed out, in Singapore, actions by the two ministers who we have raised in the very beginning prevent such check and balance from happening because by introducing POFMA, by using legal threats from on issues that the public ought to know and ought to be discussed, and not to be silenced off with all this uncalled for legal threats. And this is something that people ought to sit down, think about it, and how it should influence your vote in the upcoming general election, which must be held by this year. Once again, I would like to thank the PJ and Francis for joining me for today's episode of Political Speaking, and I hope that what we have discussed in this episode would set you off thinking whether or not there is a need for increased accountability for our public servants, especially the high-ranking public officials, so to boost the democracy that we have in our little island city-state. Well, thanks again for joining us for this week's episode, and we hope to hear from you again next.